The first sign that my son was planning to betray me came in the form of a glossy brochure. I found it tucked between the cushions of my favorite armchair in his sprawling mansion, Sunny Pines Retirement Community, where golden years truly shine. The brochure featured smiling elderly people playing bingo and eating pureed food in a sterile dining hall. I was 73, not dead, and certainly not ready for a place like Sunny Pines. I held the pamphlet in my trembling hands, the weight of it far heavier than its few pages suggested. The house around Memmy's son Richard's six-bedroom executive estate in the prestigious Oakwood Hills neighborhood suddenly felt cold despite the expensive heating system that kept the marble floors warm underfoot. Just 3 months ago, Richard had insisted I sell my modest but beloved home of 45 years and move in with him and his wife, Vanessa. "It's for your own good, Mom," he'd said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone he'd developed since becoming CEO of the company my late husband and I had built from nothing. "That old house has too many stairs, and you're all alone there. What if something happens?" I'd reluctantly agreed, partly because the arthritis in my knees had been acting up, but mostly because I thought he genuinely wanted me close by. I'd sold my home, with its garden where I'd grown prize-winning roses, and the kitchen where I'd taught Richard to bake cookies as a boy. I'd given most of the proceeds to Richard and Vanessa to invest for my care, keeping only a small amount in my personal account. Now, staring at the brochure with its artificial smiles and institutional furniture, I understood what care meant to them. The sound of Vanessa's designer heels clicking against the marble floors echoed through the cavernous living room. I quickly tucked the brochure into the pocket of my cardigan, one Richard always complained looked shabby in his immaculate home. "Eleanor, there you are," Vanessa said, her voice honey, sweet but her eyes cold as the diamonds dangling from her ears. At 45, she was nearly 30 years my junior, with a face that owed more to her plastic surgeon than to nature. "We're having the Hendersons over for dinner tonight. Would you mind eating in your room? Richard needs to discuss some business matters." It wasn't a question. Nothing in this house ever was. "Perfect." Vanessa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, and we've scheduled a tour of a lovely community for next week. Richard thinks it might be better suited to someone in your situation." My situation. As if aging was a disease, a problem to be managed and hidden away. Vanessa frowned. "Don't track in any dirt. The cleaning service doesn't come until Thursday." I nodded and made my way through the French doors to the immaculately landscaped backyard, a showpiece designed by professionals that lacked any personality or love. Unlike my old garden, nothing here was allowed to grow wild or free. Every plant had its designated space, pruned within an inch of its life. As I walked the stone path, careful not to disturb anything, I pulled out my Phonia simplified model Richard had insisted I use instead of my perfectly good smartphone. "For ease," he'd claimed, though I suspected it was to limit my access to information and people. I dialed my best friend Martha, who had been warning me about Richard's intentions since I'd sold my house. "Martha," I said when she answered, "you were right, they're trying to put me in a home." Martha's sigh carried through the phone. "Oh, Eleanor, I was afraid of this. Have you confronted Richard?" "Not yet. I just found a brochure, and Vanessa mentioned a tour next week." I lowered my voice, though no one was around to hear. "I gave them almost everything, Martha. The money from my house, most of Frank's life insurance. I have some savings they don't know about, but it's not enough to buy another place." "You can stay with me until we figure something out," Martha offered immediately. "Thank you, but no." A plan was already forming in my mind, fueled by decades of being underestimated, first as a woman in business in the 1970s, then as a widow, and now as an elderly mother. I think I need to teach my son a lesson about respecting his elders. That night, I ate my dinner alone in the guest suite, never referred to as my room, despite Richard's insistence that this was now my home. I could hear laughter drifting up from the dining room, the clink of expensive crystal, and the murmur of conversation about golf memberships and vacation properties. I picked at the bland chicken and steamed vegetables Vanessa had sent up, no salt, of course, because she decided salt was bad for my condition. My only condition was being 73 in a world that had decided I was irrelevant. After dinner, I opened my laptop, the one I'd hidden in my suitcase when moving in, knowing Richard would try to replace it with something simpler. I began researching property laws, elder rights, and the fine print of the documents I'd signed when selling my house. There had to be a way to reclaim my dignity and security. I'd spent my life building something meaningful alongside Frank, watching our small electronics repair shop grow into Franklin Electronics, a regional chain that Richard had eventually expanded nationwide after taking over. I'd raised a son, maintained a home, and supported my husband through 3 bouts of cancer before finally losing him 5 years ago. I was not going to be discarded like an outdated appliance. The next morning, I dressed carefully in one of my better outfits, a navy pantsuit I'd worn to board meetings when I was still allowed to attend them. I applied light makeup and styled my silver hair, which I'd refused to dye, despite Vanessa's not-so-subtle hints about looking younger. I waited until Richard was alone in his home office, then knocked on the door. "Come in," he called, not looking up from his computer. I entered and closed the door behind me. "We need to talk, Richard." Something in my tone made him look up. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the little boy who used to run to me with skinned knees and broken toys, looking for comfort and solutions. Then his expression hardened into the mask of the executive he'd become. "What is it, Mom? I'm rather busy." I pulled the Sunny Pines brochure from my pocket and placed it on his desk. "Would you like to explain this?" Richard's face flushed, then paled. He leaned back in his leather chair, hands steepled in front of him, a power pose he'd learned in some executive training course. "I was going to discuss this with you next week. Vanessa and I think it would be best for everyone." "Everyone? Or just you and Vanessa?" I remained standing, refusing to take the visitor's chair that would put me in a lower position. "Mom, be reasonable. This house isn't equipped for someone with your needs. Sunny Pines has medical staff, activities, people your own age." "My needs," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "My needs are respect, independence, and not being treated like a child or an inconvenience. I don't need medical staff. My last checkup was perfect except for some arthritis, which I've had for years." Richard sighed, the sound heavy with forced patience. "You're not getting any younger, Mom. What happens when you need more care? Vanessa and I both work. We can't be here all day watching you." "Watching me?" I repeated, incredulous. "I've been taking care of myself since before you were born, Richard. I helped build the company that pays for this mansion. I raised you while your father and I worked 60-hour weeks to create something from nothing. That was different. You were younger then. And now I'm older and wiser, which you might benefit from if you ever bothered to ask my opinion about anything." I straightened my shoulders. "I'm not going to Sunny Pines or any other facility. This is my home now, as you insisted when you convinced me to sell my house." Richard's jaw tightened. "Actually, Mom, legally this is my home. Your name isn't on any of the paperwork." The words hit like a physical blow. I'd known, of course, but hearing him say it so coldly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I see." I kept my voice level through years of practice. "And the money from my house? The money I gave you to invest for my care?" He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "It's been invested in a trust that will pay for your stay at Sunny Pines. It's a very exclusive community, Mom. We're on a waiting list." A waiting list. They'd been planning this for some time then. "I won't go," I said simply. Richard's expression hardened. You don't really have a choice. The tour next week is just a formality. We've already put down a deposit, and they have an opening at the end of the month. 3 weeks, I said, more to myself than to him. You're giving me 3 weeks before shipping me off. Don't be dramatic, Mom. It's not like we're abandoning you. We'll visit regularly. Like visiting a pet at a kennel, I thought bitterly. I'd like to see the paperwork for this trust, I said, and any documents related to my house sale and the money I gave you. Richard frowned. That's not necessary. Everything's been handled properly. Nevertheless, I'd like to see it. It's my money, Richard. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call in 5 minutes. Dismissed. Like an employee. Like a child. I left his office with my head high, but inside I was seething. In the hallway, I nearly collided with Vanessa, who was clearly eavesdropping. Everything okay? She asked with false concern. Perfectly fine, I replied with an equally false smile. Richard was just telling me about your plans for my future. Vanessa's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of sympathy that never reached her eyes. It's for the best, Eleanor. You'll be much happier with people your own age. And we'll have more freedom too. I mean, you'll have more freedom. The slip told me everything I needed to know about their motivations. Vanessa's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. A drive? Where? Just around. I still have my license, you know. Another thing Richard had been hinting should be reconsidered. Take your phone, she said, and be back by 4. We have the contractor coming to discuss the pool renovation. I nodded and walked away, already planning my next moves. If I had 3 weeks, I needed to use them wisely. My first stop was Martha's house, a cozy bungalow in the older part of town where we'd both raised our families. Martha, a widow like me, had downsized sensibly but maintained her independence. Her late husband had been an attorney, and though Martha had never practiced law herself, she'd absorbed enough legal knowledge to make her a valuable ally. The nerve of them, Martha fumed after I explained the situation. Her gray curls seemed to vibrate with indignation. After everything you did for that boy, Frank would be rolling in his grave. Frank would be figuring out how to fix this, I said, accepting the cup of properly strong tea Martha offered, which is what I intend to do. What are you thinking? Martha asked, her sharp eyes studying me. At 75, she was still as quick-witted as she'd been when we met at a PTA meeting 40 years ago. I'm thinking I need to remind Richard exactly who he's dealing with, I said. He seems to have forgotten that I was running the books for Franklin Electronics when he was still learning his multiplication tables. Martha smiled, a slow, mischievous smile I recognized from countless adventures over the decades. I take it, you have a plan? Legal help specifically. David, Martha said immediately, referring to her son who had followed in his father's footsteps and become an attorney. He specializes in elder law now. After what happened to the Petersons, you remember, their daughter tried to take their house? David shifted his practice. Perfect. I set down my cup. Can you call him? I'd like to meet as soon as possible. Martha was already reaching for her phone. He owes me a few dozen favors for all the babysitting I've done for his kids. I'm sure he can squeeze you in today. 2 hours later, I was sitting in David Cohen's office, surrounded by law books and family photos. David, now in his 40s with his father's kind eyes and his mother's determination, listened carefully as I explained my situation. This happens more often than you'd think, he said when I finished. Adult children deciding they know what's best, often with financial motivations thinly disguised as concern. Can they force me into this facility? I asked, getting straight to the point. Not legally, no. Not unless you've been declared incompetent by a court, which you clearly aren't. David made some notes. The money complicates things, though. If you voluntarily gave it to them without clear written agreements about its purpose, it might be difficult to reclaim. I have emails, I said. Richard was very specific about creating a trust for my ongoing care and security. I doubt he specified that meant institutionalizing me against my will. David nodded. That's helpful. What about the house sale? Do you have those documents? Copies, yes. Richard has the originals. I handed over a folder I'd brought with me. I'm not necessarily looking to get everything back, David. What I want is leverage. Leverage? David raised an eyebrow, looking so much like Martha in that moment that I had to smile. Yes, Richard responds to power. Right now, he thinks he has all of it. I need to change that equation. David leaned back in his chair, studying me with newfound respect. Mrs. Franklin, I think I'm beginning to understand why your husband's business was so successful. What exactly did you have in mind? As I outlined my plan, David's expression shifted from concerned to impressed to slightly alarmed. It's aggressive, he said when I finished. There could be blowback. I'm 73 years old, David. I don't have time for half measures. I fixed him with the same look I'd used on suppliers who tried to overcharge Franklin Electronics in the early days. Can it be done legally? How quickly can we move? If we start today, we could have everything in place within 2 weeks. Perfect timing, I thought. Then let's begin. Over the next several days, I maintained a facade of reluctant acceptance at Richard and Vanessa's home. I agreed to tour Sunny Pines, nodding politely as the overly cheerful director showed us around facilities that resembled a cross between a hospital and a budget hotel. I asked appropriate questions about mealtimes and medication management, pretending I was considering it as a viable option. See? It's not so bad, Richard said as we drove home in his luxury SUV. They even have a garden club. You love gardening. I thought of my roses, the vibrant blooms I'd cultivated for decades, compared to the sad little plots of marigolds the residents were allowed to tend. It seems very organized, I said diplomatically. Richard took this as enthusiasm. They have an opening on the 15th. We can have you moved in that weekend. 2 weeks. Perfect. If you think that's best, I said, gazing out the window at the passing scenery. Richard reached over and patted my hand condescendingly. Trust me, Mom. I know what's best for you. That evening, after another solitary dinner in my room, I called Martha. Everything's proceeding, she reported. David has the paperwork ready. He just needs your signature. How are you holding up? Martha asked, concern evident in her voice. I'm angry, I admitted, keeping my voice low, though my door was closed. But also determined. Richard needs to learn that age doesn't equal incompetence. Amen to that, Martha said. See you tomorrow. And Eleanor? You're doing the right thing. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of the too-soft bed in this impersonal guest room, surrounded by expensive furnishings that held no warmth or memories. I thought of Frank, of how hard we'd worked to build something lasting, something to pass on to our son. I thought of the values we'd tried to instill: honesty, respect, compassion. Somewhere along the way, Richard had lost sight of those values, seduced by wealth and status. The company we'd built with our hands and hearts had become just another asset to him, a means to fund his lavish lifestyle. And now I had become a liability, an inconvenient reminder of humbler beginnings. Well, I thought as I prepared for bed, he's about to be reminded of exactly who he's dealing with. Eleanor Franklin might be 73, but she was far from finished. The game was just beginning. The next morning, I woke with purpose flowing through my veins. The weight of betrayal still sat heavy in my chest, but it was now tempered with a steel of determination. I dressed carefully in one of my more expensive outfits, a gift from Richard during more generous times, and applied my makeup with precision. If I was going to war, I would do so looking my best. Downstairs, I found Vanessa at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone while picking at a kale smoothie bowl. She looked up with surprise when I entered. "You're up early," she remarked, eyes quickly assessing my appearance. "And so, dressed up." "I have errands to run," I said pleasantly, helping myself to coffee from their complicated machine that had taken me weeks to master. "Don't worry, I won't be back until after your Pilates class." A flicker of suspicion crossed her face. "What kind of errands?" "Just some personal matters. At my age, one needs to ensure everything is in order." I smiled, enjoying the momentary uncertainty in her eyes. Vanessa set down her phone. "Richard mentioned you seem to accept the Sunny Pines situation. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Eleanor." "Life is too short for conflict," I said, the irony of my words known only to me. "One must adapt to changing circumstances." She nodded, visibly relieved that the difficult elderly mother-in-law wasn't going to cause a scene. "Exactly. And you'll be much happier there. They have bridge clubs and everything." How thoughtful. I finished my coffee and rinsed the coupe, a small act of consideration I knew Vanessa never bothered with for herself. "Appointment?" The suspicion returned. "With whom?" "Just some old friends," I said vaguely. "We're not all dead yet, dear." I left her staring after me, her smoothie forgotten. Martha was waiting in her sensible sedan at the end of the block, as we'd arranged. I slipped into the passenger seat with a sigh of relief. "Operation Comeuppance is officially underway," Martha said with a grin, pulling away from the curb. "How did you sleep?" "David's waiting at his office with the paperwork. Then we're meeting Sophia at 11. Sophia Martinez had been my executive assistant during the final decade of my active involvement with Franklin Electronics. Now in her 60s, she had retired when Richard took over and began replacing the old guard with younger, more dynamic employees. We had stayed in touch, united by our shared dismay at the company's shifting values under Richard's leadership. "Did she bring the documents I asked for?" I inquired as Martha navigated through morning traffic. "Everything she could access legally," Martha confirmed. "She said you were right about Richard never changing the master passwords. Typical male overconfidence." I smiled, remembering how I'd insisted on creating the company's first digital security protocols back in the 90s, much to the amusement of the younger staff. Richard had inherited those admin credentials when he took over, apparently never considering that his technologically challenged mother had set them up in the first place. At David's office, we spent an hour reviewing legal documents. I signed where indicated, my signature strong and unwavering. "This establishes the Eleanor Franklin Foundation as a legal entity," David explained, sliding another document forward. "With you as the primary trustee and my mother as the secondary. The foundation's stated purpose is providing dignified housing and community for seniors in need." "Perfect," I said, signing the paper. "And this," David continued, "is the formal request for Richard to provide a complete accounting of the funds you transferred to him from your house sale and other assets. He has 7 business days to comply, before we file a formal complaint." I signed this document with particular satisfaction. "When will he receive this?" "I've arranged for courier delivery this afternoon," David said with a small smile. "Around 3, I believe. Just in time for Richard's important video conference with the board. How unfortunate." "Now," David said, his expression growing more serious, "are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with the real estate transaction? Once initiated, it will be difficult to reverse." "I'm certain," I said firmly. "Richard needs to understand that actions have consequences." David nodded, respecting my decision. "Then let's meet with Sophia. She has some interesting information about Franklin Electronics' current financial situation that might prove useful." Sophia was waiting for us at a quiet cafe a few blocks from David's office. She stood to embrace me warmly, her familiar perfume bringing back memories of board meetings and late nights finalizing quarterly reports. "Eleanor," she said, holding me at arm's length to study my face. "You look wonderful. Retirement suits you." "Forced retirement," I corrected with a wry smile. "But I'm working on a new venture now." We settled at a corner table, and Sophia opened her tablet. "I've brought everything I could access without raising flags. Richard may have forgotten about your administrator access, but he has surrounded himself with tech people who might notice unusual activity." "Show me what you found," I said, leaning forward. Over the next hour, Sophia walked me through a troubling picture of Franklin Electronics under my son's leadership. The company was still profitable, but Richard had been systematically stripping its long-term stability in favor of short-term gains that boosted his performance bonuses. Loyal employees who had been with us for decades were being pushed out in favor of cheaper, less experienced staff. The quality control standards Frank and I had insisted upon were being quietly eroded. Most concerning was a series of transactions Sophia had flagged involving the company's real estate holdings, including the original building where Frank had opened our first repair shop. "He's selling off the legacy properties," Sophia explained, showing me the documentation. "The official line is streamlining physical assets, but the proceeds aren't being reinvested in the company. They're being funneled into a separate holding company. Oakwood Hills Properties," I read from the screen. "That's the development company that built Richard and Vanessa's mansion," Sophia confirmed, "and several other luxury properties in the area. Richard sits on their board." I felt a cold anger settle in my stomach. It wasn't just me. Richard was discarding it, was his father's legacy, the business we had built through decades of hard work and sacrifice. "Can you print all of this for me?" I asked, my voice steady despite my inner turmoil. "Already done," Sophia said, handing me a sealed envelope. "Everything's documented with timestamps and transaction records." "Thank you, Sophia," I said, covering her hand with mine. "I know this wasn't easy for you." "Frank was good to me," she said simply. "He and you both. The company was a family then. What Richard's doing, it isn't right." After lunch, Martha drove me to our next appointment meeting with James Wilson, a real estate developer I'd known for years. Unlike the slick operations Richard preferred to deal with, James had built his business through careful, ethical development, focused on community needs rather than maximum profit. "Eleanor," James greeted me warmly in his modest office. "It's been too long. Martha mentioned you have an interesting proposition for me." "I do," I confirmed, settling into the chair he offered. "How would you feel about partnering on a senior living community? One that actually respects its residents' dignity and independence?" James leaned forward, intrigued. "I've been looking to diversify in that direction, actually. The demographic trends support it, and frankly, I've seen how my own mother was treated at one of those corporate facilities. Not well." "Exactly," I said. "I'm establishing a foundation with seed money from my personal savings. What I need is a partner who understands both real estate development and the importance of creating genuine community." "And the property?" James asked. "Location is everything in this market." I smiled. "That's the interesting part. I believe a property will be becoming available very soon in Oakwood Hills. Prime location, excellent structure, just needing some thoughtful renovation." James raised an eyebrow. "Oakwood Hills? That's ambitious. Properties there rarely change hands, and when they do, I have reason to believe this particular property will be available at a reasonable price," I said confidently. "Are you interested in hearing more?" By the time Martha dropped me back at Richard's house, it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. I felt exhausted, but exhilarated, like I'd just completed a marathon. In many ways, I had a marathon of meetings that had set in motion a plan decades in the making, though Richard didn't know it yet. As I expected, the house was in an uproar. I could hear Richard's raised voice from the moment I stepped through the door. What do you mean, an accounting of the funds? Those were gifts. She gave them to us freely. He was pacing in his home office, the door ajar, phone pressed to his ear. I slipped past unnoticed and made my way to my room, smiling to myself. The courier had delivered David's documents right on schedule. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. For once, I was invited to join Richard and Vanessa at the main dining table rather than being sequestered in my room. Not out of any newfound respect, I was certain, but because Richard wanted to confront me directly. "Mom," he began as soon as the housekeeper had served our salads and withdrawn, "I received some concerning documents today." "Oh?" I took a small bite of the meticulously arranged greens, maintaining an expression of mild interest. "Legal papers," Richard continued, his tone hardening. "Something about a formal accounting of funds and a newly established foundation. Care to explain?" I set down my fork. "It's quite simple, Richard. I've decided to take a more active role in managing my remaining assets. The foundation is a project I'm passionate about, providing quality housing for seniors who deserve dignity in their later years." "With what money?" Vanessa interjected, her voice sharp. "You gave us everything from the house sale, for your care." "Not everything," I corrected gently. "I maintained a separate account you weren't aware of. Frank always believed in having a reserve fund. A lesson he tried to teach you, Richard, though it apparently didn't take." Richard's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. You're 73 years old. You should be thinking about simplifying your life, not starting new ventures." "Age is just a number," I replied, enjoying how the cliché made him wince. Frank was still developing new product lines at 76. The difference is, he had a wife who supported his ambitions rather than trying to warehouse him. "We are not warehousing you," Richard snapped. "Sunny Pines is a top-rated facility with an excellent memory care unit," I noted. "Despite the fact that my cognitive assessments have all been perfect, curious choice." Vanessa set down her water glass with more force than necessary. "This is absurd. We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're villains." "Help me?" I repeated, allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. "By selling my home, taking my money, and planning to ship me off to an institution against my will? That's an interesting definition of help, Vanessa." "You agreed to sell the house," Richard argued. "You said it was too much to maintain." "After weeks of you insisting it was unsafe for me to live there," I countered. "And I agreed to move in here because you promised it would be my home. Yet here we are, 3 months later, and you're already trying to get rid of me." "Not get rid of you," Richard protested, though his eyes couldn't quite meet mine. "Provide appropriate care." "Care I don't need," I said firmly. "But this isn't really about my care, is it? It's about this house and appearances and your convenience." Richard pushed his plate away, appetite apparently gone. "I don't have to justify my decisions to you. I'm trying to do what's best for everyone." "Everyone meaning you and Vanessa," I clarified. "Certainly not me, and definitely not what your father would have wanted." At the mention of Frank, Richard's expression darkened. "Don't bring Dad into this. He would understand the practical realities." "Your father," I said quietly, "built a business on the principle that people matter more than profit. He would be ashamed of what you've done with his company. Selling off legacy properties to fund your lifestyle while pushing out employees who helped build Franklin Electronics." Richard's face went pale. "How do you know about that?" "I may be old in your eyes, Richard, but I'm not stupid. I still have friends, I still have resources, and I still have the administrator passwords you never bothered to change." The look of shock on his face was almost comical. Vanessa glanced between us, clearly confused. "What is she talking about, Richard?" she demanded. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Mom's confused." "Oakwood Hills Properties," I said clearly. the company that built this house, and that you've been funneling Franklin Electronics assets into through property sales. Did Vanessa know about that arrangement? Or the board? Vanessa's perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together. Richard? What is she talking about? Richard stood abruptly. This conversation is over. Mom, you're clearly upset and not thinking clearly. We'll discuss the Sunny Pines arrangements tomorrow when you're calmer. I'm perfectly calm, I assured him, and perfectly serious about the legal documents you received today. I expect a full accounting of my funds within the time frame specified. Otherwise, the next documents will come from the district attorney's office, not a civil attorney. Are you threatening me? Richard's voice rose in disbelief. I'm stating facts, I corrected. Something your father always appreciated about me. Good night, Richard. Vanessa. I left them sitting in stunned silence, my untouched dinner forgotten. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and triumph. I took no pleasure in confronting my son this way, but he had left me no choice. Sometimes, the only language people understand is the one they themselves speak. For Richard, that language was power and money. The next morning, I woke to find a text message from Martha. It's done. The offer has been accepted. Phase 2 of my plan was now in motion. I dressed quickly and made my way downstairs, where I found Richard alone in the kitchen, looking haggard. He'd clearly slept poorly. Mom, he began when he saw me, his tone conciliatory. About last night. Richard blinked, clearly thrown off script. Moving? Where? You can't possibly afford. My finances are no longer your concern, I said firmly. I've secured appropriate housing that meets my needs and preferences. This is ridiculous, Richard muttered, running a hand through his hair. You can't just... I can and I have, I stated. I'm 73, not incapacitated. I don't require your permission to live my life, Richard. Fine, he snapped, frustration breaking through his veneer of concern. If you're so determined to be difficult, go ahead. But don't come crying to me when you realize you can't manage on your own. The condescension in his voice strengthened my resolve. I managed just fine for the 5 years after your father died. I managed our household while helping build the company that pays for your lifestyle. I think I can manage now. Richard's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it impatiently. Then he froze, staring at the screen with growing alarm. What is it? I asked, though I had a good idea. Nothing, he said quickly, but his face had gone pale. Just work. As Richard hurried from the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, I allowed myself a small smile. The second set of documents must have arrived at his office, the ones detailing the offer on the property adjacent to his home. A property that, until yesterday, had been slated for development as luxury condominiums, but would now become the first location of the Eleanor Franklin Senior Living Community. Richard's reaction confirmed what I'd suspected. He had invested heavily in that development project, counting on the property values in the area continuing to rise. The sudden change in plans would not only affect his investment, but also potentially impact his own home's value. Home he had leveraged to fund other investments, according to Sophia's research. I felt no joy in causing my son distress, but perhaps this financial pressure would help him understand the precariousness he had been willing to impose on me. Sometimes, empathy can only be taught through experience. Later that afternoon, I met with Martha and David at a small cafe, far from Richard's usual haunts. David spread out a new set of documents on the table between us. The property purchase is proceeding, he confirmed. The sellers were quite eager once we matched the previous offer and removed some of the contingencies the other buyer had included. And the zoning? I asked. Already approved for multi-resident housing, David said with satisfaction. The previous developer had secured that, which works perfectly for our purposes. We can begin renovations immediately after closing. Which is when? Martha asked, excitement evident in her voice. 2 weeks, David replied. Remarkably fast, but the sellers are motivated, and we're paying cash thanks to Eleanor's private funds and the investment group James assembled. I nodded, pleased with the progress. And the other matter? David's expression grew more serious. The formal inquiry into Richard's management of your funds has been filed. His attorney contacted me this morning, suggesting a private settlement discussion. Meaning Richard wants to pay me off quietly, I translated. Essentially, yes, David confirmed. He's offering to return 70% of the original funds in exchange for you dropping the inquiry and signing a confidentiality agreement. 70% of what was mine to begin with, I mused. How generous. What are you going to do? Martha asked, stirring her tea. I considered the question carefully. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect, about consequences, about teaching a painful but necessary lesson to a son who had forgotten the values his father and I had tried to instill. But make it clear that my consideration is contingent on a face-to-face meeting with Richard. No lawyers, no Vanessa, just mother and son. David nodded, making a note. And the property development? Proceeds as planned, I said firmly. That's non-negotiable. As I sipped my tea, I felt a strange calm settling over me. The hurt of Richard's betrayal was still there, a dull ache beneath my breastbone, but it was now accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Frank's death. I was no longer just reacting to my son's schemes. I was creating something meaningful, something that might help others avoid the fate Richard had planned for me. You know, Martha said, studying my face, you look 10 years younger than you did a week ago. I smiled. Amazing what a little righteous indignation can do for one's complexion. But beneath our light banter, I knew the hardest conversation still lay ahead. Richard wouldn't surrender easily, and confronting him directly would test the limits of my resolve. Yet it was necessary not just for me, but for him too. Sometimes, the greatest act of parental love is holding your child accountable, even when that child is a 50-year-old CEO who thinks he knows better than his 73-year-old mother. The battle lines were drawn. The next move was Richard's. 3 days passed with no word from Richard. The silence was deafening in its implication. He was strategizing, consulting with lawyers, perhaps even investigating my financial resources to determine how serious a threat I posed. I remained in his home, a strange limbo of polite nods and avoided conversations. Vanessa had taken to leaving the house whenever I appeared, her discomfort palpable in the rigid line of her shoulders. On the fourth morning, as I sat in the garden with my morning tea, Richard finally approached. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered, his normally immaculate appearance slightly rumpled. He took the seat across from me without asking, setting down a leather portfolio on the table between us. Your lawyer is very thorough, he said without preamble. I've reviewed his documents. I sipped my tea, waiting. Frank had taught me long ago that silence was often the most powerful negotiating tool. A misunderstanding, I repeated, my voice neutral. Is that what you call planning to put me in a home against my will? He winced. That's not we were trying to do what's best for you. By taking my money and my independence without my informed consent? The money was for your care, Richard insisted, though his eyes slid away from mine. Sunny Pines isn't cheap. Neither is this house, I observed. Yet you seem to have found the funds for a pool renovation and a new home theater system. Richard's jaw tightened. My finances aren't the issue here. Aren't they? I set down my teacup with deliberate care, because from where I'm sitting, it seems my money has been subsidizing your lifestyle while you plan to warehouse me in an institution. That's not fair, Richard protested. No, I agreed. It isn't fair at all. We sat in tense silence for a moment, the morning birds continuing their cheerful songs around us, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. I understand you've purchased the Westfield property, Richard finally said, his tone carefully controlled. Next to Oakwood Commons. So he knew about that. I wasn't surprised. Richard had always maintained connections with local developers and real estate investors. Yes, I confirmed. It's the first location for the Eleanor Franklin Senior Living Community. Mom, that property was slated for luxury condominiums. The neighborhood association has already approved our revised plans, I finished for him. David and James were quite persuasive at the emergency meeting yesterday. It seems many of your neighbors have aging parents themselves and appreciate the concept of dignified, independent senior living close by. Richard's face flushed. You've been busy. I learned from the best, I said, allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. Your father always said that while others talk, the Franklins act. At the mention of Frank, something flickered in Richard's eyes, a complex emotion I couldn't quite decipher. Guilt? Resentment? Perhaps both. What exactly are you planning? He asked. A community where seniors can maintain their independence while having access to the support they need, I explained. Individual apartments, communal spaces for those who want companionship, gardens, a library, art studio. No institutional dining halls, no infantilizing rules, no locked memory care units for people who don't need them. That sounds expensive, Richard said, skepticism evident in his tone. Quality usually is, I agreed. Fortunately, I have excellent financial backing. James assembled an impressive group of investors who see both the social value and the business potential. Richard leaned forward, his business instincts clearly engaged despite himself. What's the model? Mixed, I said. Some units will be market rate for those who can afford them. Others will be subsidized through the foundation for seniors with limited means. We're also applying for certain tax incentives available for socially beneficial housing projects. And this is really what you want to do? At your age? The condescension in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. My age is precisely why this matters to me, I replied evenly. I've seen too many of my friends lose their dignity along with their independence. Frank and I always planned to use some of our success to make a difference. Since he's gone, it falls to me to honor that commitment. Richard was silent for a long moment, studying me with new eyes. I wondered if he was finally seeing me Eleanor Franklin, businesswoman and community leader, rather than just his increasingly inconvenient elderly mother. The legal action, he finally said. What will it take to resolve it? Full transparency, I stated firmly. A complete accounting of all the funds I transferred to you, documented evidence of how they've been used, and return of any amounts not specifically spent on my behalf with interest. Richard nodded slowly. And if I agree to this? Then we can move forward as mother and son, without lawyers between us. I paused, meeting his gaze directly. But understand this, Richard. I will never set foot in Sunny Pines or any facility like it. My housing decisions are mine alone to make. Have them send it directly to David, I instructed. And Richard, I expect it to be complete and accurate, no creative accounting. He stiffened at the implication but nodded again. Will you be staying here while your community is being developed? The question revealed his true concern, how quickly he could remove the embarrassment of his elderly mother from his pristine home. Relief flashed across his face before he could mask it. Where will you go? Martha has a lovely guest suite she's offered until my new home is ready. Richard frowned. Martha Cohen? Mom, her house is hardly suitable. The bathroom isn't even on the main floor. Unlike you, Martha asked what I wanted rather than deciding for me, I said pointedly. and my knees are quite capable of handling a flight of stairs, thank you. Our conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Vanessa at the garden door, her expression wary as she took in our tête-à-tête. "Everything okay out here?" she asked, her voice artificially bright. "Fine," Richard answered shortly. "Mom and I are discussing business." Vanessa's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Business?" "My new senior living community," I explained pleasantly. "It's being built right next to Oakwood Commons. We'll practically be neighbors." The color drained from Vanessa's face. Next toe boot, that's where they were building the new luxury development, the one that was going to have the spa and the wine bar. "Plans change," I said with a small smile. The community decided dignified housing for seniors was a better use of the space. Vanessa turned to Richard, panic evident in her eyes. "But what about our property values? The neighborhood association promised." "We'll discuss it later." Richard cut her off with a warning glance. Too late. His wife's priorities had been made abundantly clear. Property values trumped mother-in-law's welfare every time. "I should finish packing," I said, rising from my seat. "So much to do before the weekend." As I walked past them into the house, I heard Vanessa's urgent whisper, "Richard, do something. We can't have old people next door. What will the Hendersons think?" I smiled to myself as I climbed the stairs to my soon-to-be former bedroom. Vanessa's dismay was petty satisfaction, I knew, but satisfaction nonetheless. The next day, I met James Wilson at the Westfield property to review the preliminary architectural plans. The existing structurea, former corporate retreat with extensive grounds, provided an excellent foundation for our vision. "We can convert the main building into 15 spacious apartments," James explained as we walked the property, each with its own kitchen and living area. "The east wing will house communal space library, game room, art studio, and the grounds are perfect for gardens." "Individual outdoor spaces?" I asked, thinking of my roses. I nodded, pleased. "And accessibility?" "Elevators to all floors, wide doorways, bathroom modifications where needed, but nothing institutional looking," James assured me. "The goal is elegant, practical living spaces that happen to be accessible, not medical facilities pretending to be apartments." "Perfect," I said, visualizing the finished community. "When can construction begin?" "We close on the property next week. Contractors are ready to start the day after. With the existing structure, we're looking at 4 months to completion for the first phase." 4 months, just in time for what would have been Frank's 80th birthday. He would have loved this project, practical, compassionate, and a sound business investment all at once. "I'd like to be involved in the design details," I told James, "especially the common spaces." "Wouldn't have it any other way," James said with a smile. "This is your vision, Eleanor. I'm just helping make it happen." As we continued our tour, I found myself thinking of all the friends I'd lost to places like Sunny Pines' vibrant, capable people reduced to scheduled activities and institutional meals, their individuality slowly eroded by well-meaning but impersonal care. Frank and I had promised each other we'd never end up that way. Now I was creating an alternative, not just for myself, but for others who deserved better. That evening, Martha hosted a small dinner at her home to celebrate our progress. David was there with his wife, along with Sophia and James. The atmosphere was warm and convivial, so different from the tense, formal dinners at Richard's mansion. "A toast," Martha declared, raising her glass, "to Eleanor Franklin, who reminds us all that 73 is just the beginning of a new chapter." "Hear, hear," the others chorused, glasses clinking. "And to all of you," I added, deeply moved by their support, "for believing in this project and in me." After dinner, as David and James discussed legal details in the living room, Sophia drew me aside. "Something I discovered after our last meeting." The serious tone of her voice immediately put me on alert. What is it? My heart sank. How much? At least 8 million, Sophia said grimly. Possibly more. It's cleverly disguised as consulting fees and vendor payments, but when I cross-referenced with actual service providers, there are significant discrepancies. Do you think Richard knows? I asked, though in my heart I already knew the answer. Sophia hesitated. The transactions require executive approval, and they began shortly after he became CEO. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing this new betrayal. Not just of me, but of Frank's legacy, of the company we had built with integrity at its foundation. I need proof, I said finally. Documented evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. I've been gathering it, Sophia assured me. Carefully, so as not to trigger any alerts. I should have a complete file within a week. I nodded, my mind racing with implications. Thank you, Sophia. This stays between us for now. She squeezed my hand in understanding. Of course. That night, sleeping in Martha's comfortable guest room, I found myself haunted by memories of Richard as a child eager to help in the shop, proudly showing Frank and me his report cards, working alongside us during summer breaks as he grew older. Where had that boy gone? When had money and status become more important than integrity and family? The next morning, I called David and requested an urgent meeting. He arrived at Martha's house an hour later, concern evident on his face. What's happened? He asked, as soon as we were seated in Martha's sunroom, away from curious ears. I explained what Sophia had discovered, watching his expression grow increasingly grave. This goes beyond civil matters, he said when I finished. If proven, these are criminal offense: embezzlement, fraud, possibly tax evasion. I know, I said quietly. That's why I needed to speak with you immediately. I need to understand all the implications before deciding how to proceed. David leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. Eleanor, I have to be very clear. If you obtain documented evidence of these activities and don't report them, you could potentially be seen as complicit. Even though I'm no longer involved with the company? As Frank's widow and a former executive, yes. Especially given your current legal actions against Richard, which demonstrate you're actively engaged with financial matters related to the family. I nodded, having expected as much. And if I do report it? David's expression softened with sympathy. Then your son could face serious legal consequences, depending on the extent of the fraud and the jurisdictions involved, potentially including prison time. The words hung heavy in the air between us. Prison time. My son, Frank's son, behind bars. The thought was almost unbearable. I need time to think, I said finally, and to see Sophia's evidence when it's complete. Of course, David agreed. But Eleanor, don't wait too long. The longer this continues, the worse it could be for everyone involved. After David left, I sat alone in the sunroom, watching butterflies flit among Martha's flowers. The beauty of the scene contrasted sharply with the ugliness of the situation I now faced. I had begun this journey seeking justice for myself, wanting to teach Richard a lesson about respecting his elders. I had never imagined I might have to choose between protecting my son and upholding the law. What would Frank do? The question echoed in my mind. My husband had been unfailingly ethical in his business dealings, sometimes to our short-term financial detriment. Our name is on the door, he would say. That means something. Franklin Electronics had been built on trust from customers that our products would work as promised, trust from employees that they would be treated fairly, trust from investors that their money was being handled with integrity. Richard's actions betrayed that trust on every level. Yet he was still my son, the baby I had cradled, the boy I had raised, the man I had helped shape, however imperfectly, it seemed. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Accountant has prepared documentation as requested. Meeting tomorrow at my office to review. I stared at the message, wondering what the documents would show. Would they reveal the full extent of his financial manipulations, or just the portion related to my personal funds? Was he hoping to contain the damage, to keep me focused on my own grievances rather than the larger pattern of fraud? Richard's response came quickly. Prefer to keep this between family. Of course he would. Without legal witnesses, any agreements could be more easily disputed later. David comes with me, or we proceed with formal legal action, I replied firmly. There was a longer pause before his next message. Fine. 2 p.m., my office. I set down the phone, my decision crystallizing. Tomorrow would be a reckoning, not just for the funds Richard had taken from me, but for all of it. I would give my son one chance to come clean, to make amends, to find his way back to the values Frank and I had tried to instill. One chance to save himself. That afternoon, I received another call, this one from James Wilson. Eleanor, we may have a problem, he said without preamble. The neighborhood association is suddenly challenging our permits. They're claiming the property isn't zoned for the type of facility we're planning. That's nonsense, I replied. We reviewed the zoning carefully. It's approved for multi-resident housing. Yes, but they're arguing that our community constitutes assisted living, which falls under different regulations. But we're not offering medical care, I pointed out. Just independent apartments with optional communal spaces and activities. I know, James sighed. It's a technicality they're exploiting, and guess who's leading the charge? Vanessa, I said, the pieces falling into place, using her position on the association board. Got it in one, James confirmed. She's rallied several other members to oppose us. They've filed an official complaint with the zoning board. Can they stop us? I asked, anger building at this new obstacle. Delay us, certainly. Stop us? Not if we fight it properly, but it will mean additional legal costs and potentially months of hearings. Then we fight, I said firmly, whatever it takes. After hanging up, I sat back, considering this new development. Richard and Vanessa were clearly coordinating their counterattack, he handling the financial aspects while she worked to block the community project. They still didn't understand who they were dealing with. Eleanor Franklin had not survived 4 decades in business by backing down from a fight. That evening, Sophia called with news of her own. Can you meet me tomorrow morning before your appointment with Richard? Of course, I agreed. What is it? Sophia hesitated. I think it's better to show you in person. It concerns Frank's original shares in the company. A chill ran through me. Frank had left his controlling interest in Franklin Electronics to be divided between Richard and me, with Richard receiving 51% and me 49%, a division that gave Richard operational control while ensuring I maintained a significant voice in major decisions. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake in Martha's guest room, my mind cycling through scenarios, strategies, and painful memories. By dawn, I had reached a resolution that brought no joy but a certain grim satisfaction. Richard had forced my hand at every turn. Now he would face the consequences of his choices. I met Sophia at a quiet cafe far from Richard's office or home. She looked tired, but determined as she slid a flash drive across the table to me. Everything's here, she said. The offshore transfers, the falsified vendor contracts, the consulting fees to shell companies, 3 years of systematic fraud, totaling just over $12 million. The amount took my breath away. $12 million? Sophia nodded grimly. And that's not all. I found documentation of a share transfer from your account to Richard's, dated 6 months after Frank's death. It shifted 10% of your shares to him, giving him 59% total and reducing you to 39%. That's impossible, I said, shock giving way to anger. I never authorized any share transfer. I know, Sophia said quietly. The authorization appears to have your electronic signature, but the metadata shows it was created on Richard's computer, not yours. He forged my signature. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. It appears so, Sophia confirmed, and with that additional 10%, he was able to make decisions that previously would have required board approval, including the property sales to Oakwood Hills. I sat back, absorbing this new information. Not just embezzlement and fraud, but forgery as well. My son had stolen not just my money, but my voice in the company Frank and I had built together. Thank you, Sophia, I said finally. This can't have been easy for you. Frank was good to me, she said simply. He deserved better than this, so do you. As I left the cafe, flash drive securely in my purse, I felt a strange calm descend. The path forward was now clear, painful though it might be. Richard had made his choices, now I would make mine. At 2 o'clock precisely, David and I arrived at Franklin Electronics headquarters, a modern glass building that had replaced the humble storefront where Frank and I had started so many years ago. The receptionist, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, looked startled when I gave my name. Mrs. Franklin, Richard's mother, and former executive vice president of Franklin Electronics, I added pleasantly. He's expecting us. She hurriedly escorted us to the executive floor, where Richard's assistant, not Sophia, but a polished young man with an anxious expression, showed us into the conference room rather than Richard's office. Mr. Franklin will be with you shortly, he said, offering coffee that we declined. The conference room walls were lined with photos chronicling the company's growth, including several featuring Frank and me in the early days. I studied one from the grand opening of our 10th store, Frank's arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride. We had been in our 40s then, younger than Richard was now, full of dreams for the future of the business and our family. The door opened, and Richard entered with a man I recognized as Gerald Winters, the company's chief financial officer. No sign of the accountant who had supposedly prepared the documents I'd requested. Mom, David, Richard nodded curtly. I've asked Gerald to join us since he's familiar with the financial matters we'll be discussing. And to provide a witness on his side, I thought. Fine. Shall we begin? Richard gestured to a folder on the table. We've prepared a complete accounting of the funds you transferred to us as requested. You'll see that everything has been properly allocated for your care and future needs. I opened the folder and scanned the first page, noting immediately that the total amount acknowledged was nearly 30% less than what I had actually provided. This is incomplete, I said, looking up at Richard. And inaccurate. Richard frowned. It covers everything you gave us from the house sale. But not the life insurance proceeds or the personal savings I transferred, I pointed out. And even the house sale amount is understated by about $50,000. Gerald shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding about which accounts. I have copies of all the original transfer documents. I nodded to David, who produced a second folder and placed it on the table, including transfers to accounts that don't appear anywhere in your summary. Richard's expression hardened. Those were gifts, not funds for your care. That's not what you said at the time, I reminded him, and not what our email exchanges confirm. A tense silence fell over the room. Gerald looked increasingly uneasy, glancing between Richard and the documents as if trying to calculate his own risk in this situation. Perhaps, David suggested smoothly, we should take a short break to review both sets of documents and identify the specific discrepancies. Richard nodded stiffly. Gerald, why don't you work with David on that? Mom, can I speak with you privately? I exchanged a glance with David, who gave a subtle nod. Of course. Richard led me to his office next door, closing the door behind us. The space was impressive corner views, expensive artwork, a desk large enough to land a small plane. So different from Frank's practical, welcoming office that had always featured family photos and mementos from company milestones. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, as soon as we were alone. "Bringing lawyers, making accusations. This isn't how family handles things." "Family doesn't steal from family," I replied evenly, "or forge signatures on share transfers." Richard went very still. "What are you talking about?" I met his gaze directly. "I know about the share transfer, Richard. The one dated 6 months after your father died, that supposedly transferred 10% of my shares to you. The one with my electronic signature that I never authorized." "You're confused," he said, but his eyes slid away from mine. "You signed those papers. You wanted to simplify things, reduce your responsibilities." "I'm not confused," I said quietly, "and we both know I never signed any such document." Richard moved behind his desk, putting the barrier between us. "These accusations are ridiculous. You're upset about Sunny Pines, I understand that, but this vendetta—" "It's not a vendetta," I interrupted. "It's accountability, something your father valued highly." At the mention of Frank, Richard's face flushed with anger. "Don't bring him into this. He's not here." "No," I agreed sadly. "He's not here to see what you've done to his company. The offshore accounts, the embezzled funds, the fraudulent contracts." All color drained from Richard's face. "You're bluffing. You can't possibly." $12 million, Richard," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "That's how much you've diverted over the past 3 years, and I have documentation for all of it." For a moment, he looked like the little boy who had been caught stealing cookies, frightened, defensive, on the verge of tears. Then his expression hardened into something I barely recognized. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said coldly. "And if you think you can threaten me—" "It's not a threat," I corrected. "It's a choice. Your choice. What happens next depends entirely on you." Richard stared at me across the expanse of his enormous desk, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For a moment, I glimpsed vulnerability beneath his executive veneer, the little boy who had once sought my approval, who had cried when he disappointed his father. Then his expression hardened again, defensive and cold. "What exactly do you want?" he asked, his voice tight with suppressed anger. I took a seat across from him, smoothing my skirt with deliberate calm. "I want what I've always wanted, Richard. Honesty, respect, the values your father and I tried to teach you." "Cut the lecture," he snapped. "Just tell me what it will take to make this go away." His words stung more than I cared to admit. To him, this was just another business problem to solve, another inconvenience to be managed with money. "It's not that simple," I said. "This isn't about buying my silence, it's about making things right. You can have your precious senior community. Just drop this other nonsense." "The other nonsense being your systematic fraud against the company your father built," I asked quietly. "The embezzlement? The forged share transfer?" "You have no proof," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We both know that's not true." I opened my purse and placed Sophia's flash drive on the desk between us. "Everything is here: bank transfers, falsified contracts, shell companies. The metadata showing the share transfer was created on your computer, not mine." Richard stared at the small device as if it were a snake about to strike. "Who gave you this?" "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is what you're going to do now." He picked up the flash drive, turning it over in his fingers. "And if I just destroy this?" "Then copies will be delivered to the board of directors, the SEC, and the district attorney's office." I replied evenly. "David has them in safekeeping, with instructions to be followed if anything happens to me or if I give the word." Richard set the flash drive down carefully, as if it might explode. "You'd really do that? To your own son? Send me to prison?" The raw hurt in his voice nearly broke my resolve. Despite everything, he was still my child, the baby I had cradled, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had watched graduate with pride swelling my heart. I don't want that, I said softly. But this has to stop, Richard. The fraud, the lies, all of it. It's not as simple as you think, he said, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that my heart ached. The company was struggling after Dad died. The market was changing. I had to make difficult decisions. Stealing isn't a difficult decision, I pointed out. It's a crime. I was going to pay it back, he insisted. Once the Oakwood Hills investments matured, I was protecting the company, protecting your legacy. By committing fraud? By forging my signature to take control of my shares? I shook my head. That's not protection, Richard, that's betrayal. He flinched at the word. I did what I thought was necessary. And Sunny Pines? Was that necessary too? Richard had the grace to look ashamed. That was Vanessa's idea. We thought it would be better for everyone. Better for you, you mean, I corrected. More convenient. One less complication in your perfect life. You're twisting everything, he protested. We were concerned about you living alone. So concerned that you planned to put me in a facility against my will, using my own money to pay for it. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. Do you have any idea how that feels, Richard? To discover your child sees you as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Something flickered in his eyes, a moment of genuine shame, quickly suppressed. What do you want me to do? He asked again, his voice quieter now. First, you're going to return every penny of my money, the house proceeds, the life insurance, all of it, with interest. He nodded stiffly. Done. Second, you're going to restore my shares in the company, the full 49% your father intended me to have. Richard's jaw tightened. That will give you effective veto power over major decisions. Yes, I agreed. It will. Which brings me to my third condition. You're going to stop the embezzlement immediately and create a plan to return the diverted funds to the company. That's impossible, he protested. The money's been invested. It's not just sitting in an account somewhere. Then you'll have to liquidate those investments, I said firmly. However long it takes, and you'll do it without bankrupting the company or laying off employees to cover the shortfall. Richard stared at me in disbelief. You're essentially asking me to admit to fraud. To the board, yes, I confirmed. Not publicly, not to the authorities unless you refuse. And if I agree to all this, what then? Then you get a second chance, I said simply. A chance to rebuild your integrity, to honor your father's legacy the right way. Richard was silent for a long moment, calculation visible in his eyes. I could almost see him weighing options, looking for loopholes, considering whether he could outmaneuver his elderly mother one more time. The alternative, I reminded him gently, is that I take this evidence to the authorities and let justice take its course. You'd really do that? He asked again, searching my face. You'd send your own son to prison? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. Would I? Could I follow through on such a threat? I hope it doesn't come to that, I said honestly. But yes, Richard, I would. Because your father and I raised you to be better than this. Because the company deserves better. Because sometimes love means holding people accountable for their actions. Something shifted in Richard's expression, a subtle change I might have missed if I hadn't spent 50 years learning to read the faces of the men in my life. It wasn't surrender, exactly. More like recognition. For perhaps the first time in years, he was truly seeing Minot as an elderly parent to be managed, but as Eleanor Franklin, a woman of substance and determination. I need time, he said finally, to figure out how to do this without destroying everything. You have 1 week to present me with a detailed plan, I said, rising from my chair. I suggest you start by having an honest conversation with the board's financial committee. And Vanessa, he asked. She doesn't know about all of this. I raised an eyebrow. Doesn't she? The woman who suggested Sunny Pines has no idea where the money for her lifestyle comes from. Richard looked away. She knows we're comfortable. She doesn't ask questions about the details. Then perhaps it's time she did, I suggested. A marriage built on secrets is no foundation for happiness, Richard. Your father and I shared everything, the struggles and the successes. It's different now, he muttered. The expectations, the lifestyle. Those are choices, I reminded him. Choices with consequences. And I want the paperwork for my return shares by tomorrow. As I turned to leave, Richard called after me. Mom. I paused at the door, looking back at my son, this complicated man who had brought me both my greatest joys and deepest disappointments. How did you know? He asked. About the offshore accounts, the contracts, all of it? I smiled slightly. I built this company alongside your father, Richard. Did you really think I wouldn't have people still loyal to what we stood for? Without waiting for his response, I rejoined David in the conference room, where he and Gerald were still reviewing documents. We're finished here, I told them. Richard and I have reached an understanding. David looked at me questioningly, but I gave a slight shake of my head. Explanations would come later, away from Gerald's attentive ears. Very good, David said, gathering his papers. Gerald will be in touch about the revised accounting. As David and I left the building, he waited until we were safely in his car before asking, "What happened in there?" I gave Richard a choice, I said simply, redemption or ruin. And which did he choose? We'll know in a week, I replied, but I hope he's chosen the harder but better path. David studied me for a moment. You're an extraordinary woman, Eleanor Franklin. No, I corrected him with a small smile. Just a mother who refuses to give up on her son, no matter how sorely he tests my patience. The next 7 days passed in a blur of activity. While waiting for Richard's response, I threw myself into the senior community project. James had successfully challenged Vanessa's zoning objections, proving conclusively that our planned facility qualified as independent living, not assisted care. Construction permits were approved, and work began on renovating the main building. I spent hours with the architects, insisting on details that would make the spaces both beautiful and practical. Large windows to let in natural light. Kitchens with counters at varying heights to accommodate residents who preferred to cook standing or seated. Gardens designed with raised beds for easier access. A library with comfortable chairs and good lighting. This is going to be something special, James commented as we reviewed the updated plans. Not just another retirement facility. That's the point, I told him. We're creating homes, not hospital rooms. Places where people can continue to grow and contribute, not just wait out their final years. Martha accompanied me on these planning sessions, offering her own insights and occasionally reining in my more ambitious ideas. Not everyone has your energy level at 73. She reminded me after I suggested daily dance classes in the community center. Maybe make those weekly, with gentle movement options daily. I valued her perspective, so different from the dismissive attitudes I'd encountered from Richard and Vanessa. Martha saw my age as simply another phase of life, not a problem to be managed. On the 5th day after my confrontation with Richard, I received an unexpected visitor at Martha's house. Vanessa arrived mid-morning, looking uncharacteristically subdued in a simple blouse and pants, rather than her usual designer ensemble. "May I come in?" she asked when Martha showed her to the sunroom where I was reviewing fabric samples for the community's common areas. I nodded, curious about this unprecedented visit. "Of course. Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you." Vanessa perched awkwardly on the edge of a chair, her usual poise absent. I owe you an apology, Eleanor." Of all the things I had expected her to say, this wasn't one of them. Oh? Richard told me everything, she said, her voice unsteady. About the money, about Sunny Pines, about all of it. I see. I set aside my fabric swatches, giving her my full attention. I didn't know, she insisted, her eyes pleading for belief. About the company funds, I mean. I knew about Sunny Pines, of course, but Richard said it was for your own good, that you needed more care than we could provide. And you believed that, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Vanessa looked down at her hands. I wanted to believe it. It was convenient. Having you in the house was cramping your style, I suggested when she faltered. She winced. That sounds terrible. But accurate, I pointed out. Yes, she admitted quietly. I'm not proud of it. The thing is, Eleanor, I never really knew how to relate to you. You're so capable, so sure of yourself. Richard's mother, but also this business legend he both admires and resents. It was easier to think of you as just an elderly woman needing care than to face the reality of who you are. Her honesty surprised me. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps even accusations, not this raw vulnerability. Thank you for your candor, I said after a moment. It can't have been easy to come here and say these things. Vanessa shook her head. It's not enough, I know, but I wanted you to hear it from me directly. Richard is. He's struggling with all this, with facing what he's done, with figuring out how to make it right. As he should be, I said. Actions have consequences, Vanessa, even when those actions are motivated by greed rather than malice. I know. She hesitated, then asked, the senior community you're building, is that still happening? Absolutely, I confirmed. Construction has already begun. Good, she said, surprising me again. It's a good idea, a needed one, my own mother. She paused, blinking rapidly. My mother is in a place like Sunny Pines. She hates it, but I didn't know what else to do. She couldn't live with Yusa at least, that's what I told myself. I studied her with new interest. How old is your mother? 68, Vanessa said. Younger than you, actually, but she had a fall last year, and the doctors said she shouldn't live alone. I didn't even consider having her move in with us. Because of me? I asked. She nodded, shame evident in her expression. Partly. I told myself we didn't have room for two mothers, in-law. But the truth is, I was afraid of the responsibility, of having to adjust our lifestyle. Perhaps your mother might be interested in our community. I suggested, when it's completed, it's designed specifically for people who value their independence but might benefit from having others nearby. Hope flickered in Vanessa's eyes. Really? You'd consider that, after how I've treated you? The community isn't about me, I told her. It's about creating better options for all seniors, including your mother. Vanessa blinked back tears. Thank you. I don't deserve your kindness. It's not about deserving, I said. It's about doing what's right. After Vanessa left, Martha emerged from the kitchen where she had tactfully retreated during our conversation. Well, that was unexpected, she commented, settling into the chair Vanessa had vacated. Indeed, I agreed. I think Richard's confession has shaken her worldview considerably. Good, Martha said firmly. That girl needed shaking up, though I noticed she managed to make herself a victim in the story The Innocent Wife Who Knew Nothing. Richard has always compartmentalized his life. It's entirely possible he kept the worst of his activities hidden from Vanessa. Martha said skeptically. Well, I'm reserving judgment until I see real change from both of them. A wise approach, I agreed. Words are easy. Actions require courage. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after our confrontation, Richard called to request a meeting. I have the plan you asked for, he said, his voice subdued. Can we meet somewhere? Not at the office. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near Martha's house, neutral territory, where we could speak privately without the corporate trappings that seemed to bring out the worst in my son. Richard arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio and looking more humble than I had seen him in years. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by casual pants and a simple button-down shirt that reminded me of how he used to dress before corporate success changed him. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as he took the seat across from me. "I'm listening," I replied, neither warm nor cold, waiting to see what he had prepared. Richard opened the portfolio and removed several documents. First, the share transfer restoring your 49% ownership in Franklin Electronics. "It's already been filed with the corporate secretary and the board has been notified." He slid the papers across to me. I reviewed them carefully, noting they were properly executed and notarized. "And the company funds?" I asked, setting the share documents aside. Richard took a deep breath. "That's more complicated. I've prepared a full accounting of all diverted funds, 12.3 million in total." He passed me another document, this one considerably thicker. "I've met with the board's financial committee and disclosed everything." I looked up in surprise. "Everything?" He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Everything. The offshore accounts, the fake vendor contracts, all of it." "And their response?" "They've placed me on administrative leave pending a full investigation," he said quietly. "They've also frozen my personal assets except for a basic living allowance." I hadn't expected such swift and severe consequences. "I see, and you agreed to this?" "I didn't have much choice," Richard admitted. Once I started explaining, it became clear the board wasn't going to accept half measures. Gerald had already raised concerns based on our meeting last week. "What happens next?" I asked. "And you're prepared to make full restitution?" "Your house?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "Vanessa agreed to this?" A pained smile crossed Richard's face. "Not initially, but when faced with the alternative potentially going to prison, she came around. We've already listed the property." I sat back, absorbing this information. The consequences were more severe than I had anticipated, yet Richard seemed almost relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "This is a personal letter of apology to you, along with a cashier's check for the full amount I took from your personal funds, plus interest." He slid an envelope across the table. Through the paper, I could feel the check inside, tangible evidence of his commitment to making amends. "I don't expect forgiveness," Richard said softly. "What I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know I'm truly sorry, Mom. Not just for taking your money, but for betraying your trust. For forgetting the values you and Dad taught me." For the first time in our conversation, I heard genuine remorse in his voice. No, just regret at being caught, but true understanding of the harm he had caused. "Your father would be proud of you today," I said after a moment. "Not for what you did, but for how you're facing it now, with honesty and courage." Tears welled in Richard's eyes, something I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "I miss him," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I keep wondering what he would say about all this." "He would say that mistakes, even terrible ones, don't define us," I told him gently. "It's how we repair the damage that matters." Richard nodded, wiping discreetly at his eyes. "Vanessa and I have been talking about that, about what comes next for us. The house sale will cover most of the restitution, but we'll be starting over financially." "Sometimes starting over is the best thing that can happen," I suggested. "It clarifies what truly matters." "That's what we're discovering," Richard agreed. "We've found a small house to rent once ours sells. It's actually not far from where you and Dad lived when I was growing up." The irony wasn't lost on me. My son, who had been so eager to place me in a care facility, was now facing his own downsizing and simplification. "Your senior community," Richard said hesitantly. Vanessa mentioned you might consider her mother as a resident. If she's interested, I confirmed. We'll be opening in about 3 months. And you? Richard asked. Will you be living there too? But I'll also be serving as the foundation's executive director. It seems I'm not quite ready for retirement after all. A genuine smile broke through Richard's somber expression. That sounds like you. Always another project, another challenge. I understand that now, Richard said quietly. I didn't before. I saw your age as a limitation, a problem to solve. I was wrong. Yes, I agreed. You were, but you're learning. We finished our coffee in a companionable silence that felt like the beginning of healing, not a return to what had been, but perhaps the foundation of something new and more honest between us. 3 months later, I stood on the steps of the newly completed Eleanor Franklin Senior Living Community, preparing to cut the ribbon at our grand opening celebration. The autumn sun shone warmly on the gathered crowd, future residents and their families, local officials, members of the press, and the team who had worked tirelessly to bring the project to fruition. Martha stood beside me, elegant in a blue dress she had purchased specially for the occasion. James Wilson and his construction team were gathered nearby, pride evident in their faces as they surveyed what they had created. David and his family had come to celebrate, along with Sophia and other old friends from Franklin Electronics. In the front row, somewhat to my surprise, stood Richard and Vanessa. They had kept their word, selling their mansion and moving to a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. Richard was working with the board to make full restitution to the company, accepting a significantly reduced role and salary as part of his penance. It would take years to repay everything, but he was committed to the process. Vanessa's mother, Catherine, was among our first residents, already settled into her apartment with a balcony overlooking the gardens. The relationship between mother and daughter was healing slowly as they navigated a new dynamic based on respect rather than obligation. As I prepared to speak, I caught Richard's eye. He nodded slightly, a gesture of support and perhaps something more in acknowledgement of the journey we had taken, the painful truths we had faced, and the new understanding we were building. Welcome, I began, addressing the assembled crowd. Today we celebrate not just the opening of a building, but the beginning of a community. A place where age is recognized, not as a limitation, but as a different phase of life, rich with possibility and purpose. I looked out at the faces before Messam, young, some old, all part of this new venture in some way. When my late husband Frank and I started our first business, we had a simple philosophy: treat people with dignity and success will follow. That same philosophy guides this community. Here, every resident will be respected as an individual with unique needs, preferences, and contributions to make. I gestured to the building behind me, elegant, yet practical, designed with both beauty and function in mind. This is not a facility, it's not an institution, it's a collection of homes where people can live independently while enjoying the benefits of community, where assistance is available but not imposed, where each person decides what their golden years will look like. My gaze found Richard again, and I continued with words I had not planned but felt compelled to share. Life teaches us many lessons if we're willing to learn. One of the most important is that it's never too late to change, to grow, to forge new paths. Another is that true strength often comes disguised as vulnerability, and real power lies in choosing dignity over pride. I lifted the ceremonial scissors, their blades catching the sunlight. I dedicate this community to everyone who believes that age is not a burden to be managed, but a journey to be embraced. To everyone who knows that the wisdom of years deserves respect, not dismissal. And to the memory of Frank Franklin, who taught me that the measure of a life well lived is not in what we accumulate, but in what we contribute. With those words, I cut the ribbon, officially opening the doors to the community that had emerged from betrayal and hurt, transformed through determination into something beautiful and meaningful. As applause erupted, Martha squeezed my hand. "Frank would be so proud," she whispered. "Yes," I agreed, watching as residents and visitors began to stream into the building that would now be my home and my purpose. "I think he would." Later, as I showed Richard and Vanessa around the community, I noticed a subtle change in how my son looked at Minot, with the patronizing concern of recent years, but with something approaching respect. Perhaps even admiration. "You did it, Mom," he said as we stood in the community garden where my transplanted roses were already flourishing. "You turned a painful situation into something remarkable." "That's the thing about gardens, Richard," I told him, touching a fragrant bloom. "And about life. With the right care and attention, even after a harsh winter, new growth is always possible." As the sun began to set on that first day of my new chapter, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with ending and everything to do with beginning again. At 73, I had reclaimed not just my financial security and independence, but something far more precious: my voice, my purpose, and my power to create positive change. The mansion that had never felt like home was behind me now. Ahead lay a future I had designed on my own terms, surrounded by a community that valued what age and experience had to offer. Not a diminished existence to be managed, but a rich life to be lived fully, one day at a time. Eleanor Franklin was just getting started.